All right, welcome back. I just want to make an announcement that we're allowing the groups to still trickle in, and we'll start the moderator report back in about 5 minutes time. So for those of you online, just bear with us a few minutes while we gather people back up, and we'll start soon. Thank you.
Welcome back to the segment of the group that's back. You guys can't hear us?
Your mic on?
I think it just turns on. Hello? Hello? Okay. Welcome back to those who are already back. I think there's a few groups still cranking away Moderators who are going to be spokespersons from your breakout groups, please come up to the front and we'll get started momentarily. Yeah, heard your name. Yeah, pleasure to meet you. Okay. Okay, awesome. Where are you at? Okay, right. Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, right, with you. Yeah, I haven't been directly. Oh, does it? Okay, well, let's keep in touch. Yeah. Are you in the Bay Area, or where are you at? Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Nice. Well, thanks for introducing yourself. Take it easy.
Darren?
Hey, Grace.
Oh, I haven't had a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, well, it's an odd place to kind of meet. Are the mics on? Or?
Yeah.
How'd your group go? It is. You're not the only one. We can try to nudge. We got somewhere with respect to it.
Yeah, no, I good information for sure. I just have to organize it before they get to me. It's fine.
You picked the right side of the,
Yeah, exactly.
the podium. Too.
Yeah, this will first be the day where it's like, let's switch things up.
We won't mix it up. Yeah, no, now that you said that, we won't mix it up. We'll go. Although then I'm going to go after John, but I can just say, well, John covered this because we moderated the same thing.
Are we going to do like just set a clock for 3 minutes? Would that be good enough?
I think you're right on that. Roughly 3, yeah.
Pretty well designed, John. Yeah, I've learned a little bit, but it's incredibly well designed.
So I don't know. So 10:45. I guess we're going till. Well, this is. We've got some talks to squeeze in, so I'm gonna go grab my schedule and kind of remind myself.
Doesn't look like we have any talks. It's a breakout session, report
Well,
back,
the wrap up.
and then the wrap up is David and John. So it's like 30 minutes. But I guess if we start 10:45, go to 11:45.
We want to leave Q&A. So yeah, 10:45 to like 11:15, 11:20 for the report outs.
Right.
Then Q&A. I think we're gonna have a lot of folks come up, and then it'll be.
So I think we give everybody 3 minutes.
Yep.
10 people, we should be done in 30 minutes.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So we got to hold to it pretty strictly because we're kind of behind.
Okay.
You want to go? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So, in an effort to make sure that people don't miss their planes and we actually have an audience and people aren't running out the door, we're going to get started. So the goal is going to be 3 minutes per for the report out from each of the moderators, and that should hopefully give us enough time for a Q&A as well and some additional comments, and then closing remarks, I guess, from John and the others. So, Rio, do you want to get started?
Sure, thanks. Rio Hirose, I was in the transplant professionals group discussing what metrics we want to see collected, measures, not just metrics, but also data and information. So we didn't limit ourselves to metrics. We started our discussion by defining what the goal should be. And again, as that pyramid that we showed on day one, the goal should be really the driver between, of thinking about what behaviors we want to incentivize, what actions we want centers, OPOs, and others to take. And the overarching goal that was, I think, achieved or thought about the most is actually providing accurate information to all stakeholders and to demonstrate things like transplant benefit and the value. Now, that's an important goal and obviously the overarching goal, but there were many other goals that we came up with, including the improvement of actual patient care, improving access, improving equity, and then we even got to more granular goals like increasing preemptive kidney transplants, increasing the organ supply by decreasing discards or increasing utilization, increasing live donor transplants, and again, overall increase in utilization. And these are the most popular goals that were set, and again, improving equity was an underlying theme among all the goals that we wanted to set. How did that drive the metrics that we chose? Well, we wanted to make sure that whatever metric we chose drove to one of those goals. So for example, the things that we came up with is not only things like quality of life data collection, which we think is a mandatory, not an optional thing that we have to think about collecting. And whether in the short term it's center specific and in the long term not center specific and you know, just overall patient population, again, stratified by all sorts of socioeconomic determinants of health, that we thought is a priority. The thing about quality of life is that you can measure lots of things like functional status, pre and post transplants, again, complication rates. These are things that really affect a transplant patient's quality. How many days in the first 365 after transplant that they spent out of the hospital or in the hospital? That's more than just length of stay, that's more than just readmission rates. It's how many days did you actually spend out of the hospital in the first year post-transplant? And again, why do we want to use that metric? We want to improve patient experience, we want to improve patient care. To understand those things, we have to measure these things. Utilization of marginal donor organs. Again, the goal is to transplant more patients and to incentivize use of them. So we have to measure them and report them in a fashion which incentivizes use of these things. There's also a very universal sentiment that we need to really understand what happens to every referred patient, every patient that actually undergoes evaluation, every patient that goes evaluation, whether they're listed, deferred, or taken off the list, and more granular reasons why they're denied listing. Again, as stratified not only by overall, but social and economic determinants of health, cultural, linguistic, ethnic, all these criteria and factors need to be thought of as influencers in these outcomes. And we must study them that way, and we must collect them this way. Even the notion that we have data between the time of listing and then finally by the time that they get transplanted, that can be an enormously long time. Some people definitely wanted updates on this during that time. Some people changed insurances, some people changed their health status. We don't really update this, particularly in patients that wait a long time for transplants. Live donor transplants are the percentage of registered recipients as a good metric to drive increasing living donation. There's some metrics that we thought of in terms of OPO metrics and transplant centers, like late decline rates of transplant centers. Acceptance and decline patterns, not only stratified by organ quality and organ type, but also risk stratified for the kind of patients and the kind of recipients that you're being offered for. What's your preemptive rate of transplant before dialysis? What about donor hospitals? You know, really putting teeth into the notion that you had not only when did you get the referral? Way over, sorry. All right, I'll stop there. Okay.
All right, I'm John Snyder. I was fortunate to moderate the OPO group. I don't have as many flip chart sheets as Dr. Hirose here, so I'm not as earnest. Our metrics really fell into two major buckets. The first one is, I think, the obvious one in the room is the better definition around donor potential, and so they tackled that, and they really felt that what was most needed was collaboration between our departments of health and human services entities, between HRSA and CMS, to mandate direct reporting from donor hospitals through some sort of API, whether that's into CMS or into the OPTN or into the SRTR, of in-hospital ventilated deaths with standardized reporting of ICD-10 diagnostic and procedure codes, so that we can better define what that denominator of true donor potential is. The OPOs on our group felt that they have the data in their EMRs and would be willing to share it up to the OPTN if their definitions could be put in place. So willingness to work with the data advisory committee to make that happen. In the meantime, though, they felt that the ultimate solution, the better solution for public trust, was direct reporting from the donor hospitals, and encouraged our health and human services colleagues to collaborate on that effort. Second primary focus of the group was more and better metrics around the entire process. And I thought one of their unique insights was to create our own subway map for the donation process, right, with stops along the way, and then find whether we can find data and metrics for each of those stops. But critical to that was key event times. We need better capture of stops. Sort of, we came up with A through F, right? When was the OPO first notified of the case? Stop B, the time of the donation conversation with the family, when was that happening? Stop C, what was the time the match run was implemented? What are the times within the match run that the centers were made primary? This way we can measure how long the centers are taking to consider the case and either answer yes or no. What was the time of the final acceptance? What was the time death was declared? What was the time of recovery of the organs, cross-clamp? We would have separation of the process by whether the donor was in the DCD pathway or the brain dead pathway. And then finally, what was the time of arrival at the transplant center? And mixed into all of that is if the case was if it did not result in a donor or successfully organs transplanted, when in the match run did the OPOs stop making primary offers? That could perhaps be captured if we had better time of when primary was happening within the match run. So they felt that all of that, if we had each of those stops along the process, we could then design performance metrics around each of those components of the process. One of the unique aspects that came out of the OPO groups was the...
Yeah, wrap it up.
If there could be a live, like green, yellow, red system taxation, how busy is the national system right now, defined by how many cases are going around the country, how many donor cases per 24-hour period. So that was one idea.
James Pittman, again, another professional group that was moderated by myself and Sumit, and we had very brilliant, bright people making great contributions. I'll keep this brief and probably won't be able to get into all the great discussion and detail that we did in our breakout session. However, we talked about the transplant rate and the differences by organ and really needing more granularity around that. So, you know, for breaking out living donor, deceased donor overall rates, including that MELD and by status. Interesting, the SRTR tools calculating wait list and transplant rates include living donor for liver, but not for kidney. There was some concerns around, you know, some of the data may be skewing because of the way in which the practices or policy processes that people deal with living donors with regard to when they get listed. So we're looking at dialysis start time for that as like the denominator for all, so that we kind of really kind of level set. Then also looking at you know, measures of performance to avoid dialysis for that specifically. We also want to talk about waitlist measures. Again, this is a common theme that's come up before, so the whole referral to evaluation to listing. We were very concerned about the burden, the data burden that this could potentially place on a transplant program. And so really want to encourage going upstream and using existing data sets like USRDS data, or partnering with CMS to require the dialysis centers maybe to enter this information as a potential evaluation candidate. And then also we can do the same possibly with some of the health exchange information. Again, trying to avoid the transplant data burden. But really, if we could solve for this, we'd be able to answer so many other questions, right? And track a lot of the measures I think that other people have already discussed. It's probably one of the biggest voids and blind spots that we have. Then also discussion around clinical decision support for organ offers. Either improve or eliminate KDPI. Does survival actually reflect what we are seeing empirically with that, and maybe having, some CDS tied into this so that we have better information in utilizing this, and also being able to evaluate whether this is actually working. And then we talked about, just the whole, or just briefly a comment made is really, looking at 1-year outcomes in and of itself the right approach, and what have been the impacts over that over the years, and I'll hand things over to Krista.
All right. Well, I am very pleased to report on another virtual professional session co-moderated by Dr. Kosiski, and we really thank our expert contributors. There is a lot of synergy to what's been said, so I'll go until Sumit calls time. Well, we considered across the journey pre-transplant, there was a strong desire to fully characterize the journey, to capture referrals, and with regard to the numerator, it was felt that the information was out there, but there was some debate as to who should be reporting. Should it, for example, for kidney, should it be the dialysis unit versus the transplant center? Using dialysis units would miss preemptives. It was suggested this could be piloted at a set of transplant centers with standardized forms. There is a desire to define the denominator for referrals, and the community needs to define eligible end-stage population, as Dr. Asher challenged us yesterday. There was a call to quantify the proportions progressing from referral to evaluation to listing, so as Sumit describes, each phase serving as the denominator for the next phase. And then all stratified by social determinants of health, and a call to capture measures on care partner access, financial reserve, language barriers. We had some good pediatrics representation, and there was a request to consider those transitioning from pediatrics to adult lists and more granularity in reasons for removal. There were some concerns that pediatric patients could be characterized as non-compliant in inappropriate ways. Living donation, our colleague Heather Hunt is going to cover that in detail, but again, reinforcing a desire to capture information on candidates and characterize rates of progression from evaluation to donor approval to donation, and characterize rates of patient loss with attention to social determinants of health. Within deceased donation, again, our PEDS representation request to capture measures of pediatric donor conversion, better capture of denominator from a pediatric donor hospital. With regard to process and discard, a request to measure and report more on expedited placement utilization. How is that being utilized effectively? And then concern for measuring efficiency and ways to reduce cold time. Again, the theme of concerns for OPOs not making kidney offers until cross-clamping, reporting those events, better understanding how to prevent that, and a synergistic request to improve measures of organ quality, improve the KDPI, removing race as the community is discussing, but really recalibrating that measure for more accuracy. With regard to outcomes, a request to improve the DGF definition, that a single episode of dialysis, and again in the context of kidney, is not a very good measure, and should we be looking at sustained requirement for dialysis as well as the EGFR when a patient is taken off dialysis. And then post-transplant, emphasis on patient-reported outcomes using validated instruments, and I am almost done. So tools, that, for example, that could be administered in the waiting room, getting patient participation, and again, by social determinants of health. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Heather Hunt, a liver donor, and I co-hosted with Dr. Hart a virtual session with patients. So this was inherently different than the kind of discussion the professional groups had. So I'm just going to give you sort of a high-level sense of the punchlines, and maybe I can make up a minute. In the first instance, there was interest in data on patient access to transplant, like the patient in front of me, and that was by a referring provider, in the shortest amount of time possible. Inherent to that is the need for easily accessible center-to-center comparative data. I thought about the 6-year-old we heard about yesterday who would like the SRTR site to look more like Amazon's. Most of our time was focused on living donation, and I think that was attributable in large part to the number of kidney patients in the group who understand that the optimal way forward for them is through living kidney donor transplantation. There was interest in performance metrics on living donation to drive increases in living donation. An example of that we spent some amount of time on was, for example, the amount of time it takes for potential living donor to be evaluated. There was a few expressions that, depending on where you live, the system to evaluate and move people forward to living donation is broken. You know, there's a lot of variation and disparity across the country in that respect. So the punchline was a call to you all, to this community, to brainstorm about what metrics could be deployed to drive living donation, and the goal of that would be to make more of the right living organ donor transplantations happen. And I'll also add personally to help inform meaningful living donor consent. There was mention again about the disparities across centers by way of time and support offered to help people find living donors, and an information to help people find those centers that go through that process most efficiently. With that call to lean into living donation, there was discussion that the system owes it to donors, potential donors, and their families to collect long-term data. That was perceived as kind of a moral and ethical obligation that would come along with a move to increasing living donation. There was no question about whether long-term data is needed. The question is how. There was an expression that, and I'll read the quote, "Every center in the country needs to be part of the Living Donor Collective." There was then uniform expression of support for that across the entire group. There was recognition that the opportunity the Living Donor Collective presents to assess and then reduce the amount of data that centers are currently required to collect from living donors. So there was interest in that, capturing efficiencies once data collection for the long term is shifted to the Living Donor Collective. There was also need, finally, for, I didn't get the minute, the need for public funding to do that, right? This is a societal need, long-term living donor data. Congress asked for information about that, so that sort of underscores the public interest in it, and it should be publicly funded. Thanks.
3 minutes is tough. It's hard to give time back as much as we might want. Let's see what we can do. So I co-moderated another OPO session with Sean Van Slyke, who is catching a flight right now. Some of this will be repetitive, but some of it's worth emphasizing and re-emphasizing just the importance of the long-term vision of collecting primary data directly from donor hospitals and requiring that data collection in real time, very clinically granular data, and captured through EHRs and API connections to make it feasible and doable. That opens up so many doors for improving opportunities for measuring the system at the donation side and identifying missed opportunities, those real missed opportunities that shouldn't be taking place, and interventions that could correct those. That will help open up the opportunity for, again, identifying a true donor potential denominator, but the data are needed first to really study that and again, determine which cases are sort of no-goes or rule-outs and how risk adjustment would happen. Risk adjustment was a theme, the importance of risk adjustment throughout OPO-related metrics, but again, opening up a door for donor hospital metrics and accountability at the donor hospital level with something akin to a donor referral effectiveness rate. Timeliness of referrals, not missing opportunities for referrals, but donation opportunities. A lot of those definitions would still need to be worked out. What is a timely referral? But we need the data to start measuring it. The group did talk about actually an opportunity to streamline a bit and remove some metrics that are arguably out of date and redundant and maybe just cause extra work, and that is the imminent and eligible data collection. That is something being talked about now at the OPTN. Maybe it is time, given the direction in the field and other metrics that are coming online and the long-term vision, that there can be some streamlining in removing the imminent and eligible definitions and data collection and the metrics that are derived from those, but not really used as much as they were in the past. We talked about the deceased donor family perspective and what do they want to know. I mean, at this really challenging, awful time, they're not going to be looking at the SRTR website. Yet the SRTR OPO-specific reports may be augmented to contain information that then the OPO can use to counsel families in terms of how long is the process going to take. What is the typical time from a brain death declaration to actual recovery? Is it going to be a day? Is it going to be 2 or 3 days? As well as who can become a donor. Family members really want to know kind of what is is it always going to be the case that my loved one's organ is going to be used, or are there legitimate medical reasons that the organ may not be used? That's really not a metric. That's really not even necessarily data, but it's information to convey in that real time. And then last, process measures. And value, mapping out the process and the value stream. One new metric, a process metric that was conceived of, might be something like a pursuit rate. How often are OPOs pursuing medically complex donors? How do they compare to their peers for process improvement, not necessarily a regulatory metric? Thank you.
All right. 3 minutes. This was tough, guys. Okay, so I'm Rachel Patzer, and I co-moderated with Amin Tabatabi, and we were in the patient, donor, and family group, and we have a lot of recommendations. So I'm going to try to go quickly. In the kind of pre-transplant realm, information about end organ failure across all organs, so number of patients with end organ failure, and looking that again across all organs was really important. Education about patients, education about transplant as a treatment option. We talked a bit about this, and having something beyond just a checkbox. So a knowledge assessment, something that might be patient reported, some kind of survey that patients could work with us on developing that, again, across all organs, that would really ensure that patients understand the value and the benefits, survival benefits of transplant, among other things. Referral for transplant was an important measure we talked about. Where is the referral coming from? The referral, having that documentation, we talked about the measurement should come from the transplant center so that we're capturing kind of the two-way communication between the referring providers and the transplant program, and knowing information about the time between steps, so the time from end-stage organ failure to the referral, and then the referral to the later steps was really important. We also talked about looking at this across all the sociodemographic information, really critically important. We talked about race, ethnicity, age, disability, English language, social support, patient address to capture travel burden, and probably missed a few. And then we talked about dividing between this evaluation stage and sort of starting the evaluation and then completing the evaluation, and really having more information on the waiting list around the decision to the sort of the transparency. We talked about how the active versus inactive status is really important, where patients are, and having updates throughout the process. So even we think about on the wait list, patients having sort of inactive active status and those updates, but even before that, patients who just have end organ failure, we talked a lot about dialysis patients, but they think that they are already on the waiting list. So having updates sort of where they are in the transplant process as early as possible. And again, sort of timing between all these measures was really important. So sort of moving on to post-transplant in 30 seconds. General recommendations here, we've got, let's see here, for request for surgical recovery, length of time, hospital stay, rehospitalization rate, chance that complications might happen, comprehension of critical content about side effects, medication protocol, and complications, having this be patient-reported outcomes, survival after transplant, patient activation measure over time like depression and anxiety, quality of life, long-term survival and graft loss, tracking quality of life, graft survival, death out to 10 years, very important. And then just two more things very quickly. The information about living donor complications, focus should be on the donor and the recipient. The same information that the donor gets, or that the recipient gets, the donor wants that information on longer term outcomes. And then donor discard, we talked about this. This is not a term that our patient and group like. They do not like that term. They want to call this something else. It's offensive, and they want to think about maybe it's organs not placed, but we didn't talk as much about the metrics for this, but they really want to emphasize that any metrics that involve anything with organ recovery, organs declined, anything organ discard related, patients want to be involved in that measure development. I'll stop there.
Hope you're typing fast, Corey.
I've got more notes for you, Corey.
Good morning, Grace Leiden. I co-moderated a session with Dr. Schaffhausen of professionals. We had representation from kidney and liver. We had several physicians on the virtual call, as well as people from quality management and NATCO. And our discussion was very rich, but really just revolved around two buckets. There was a lot of discussion about pre-listing, as we've already heard, specifically starting at referral. And we came up with several metrics to support both patients and also referring providers. And then the other bucket was more information on causes of death on the wait list. That was also to support patients and to internally inform center practice. So I'll get into that. On the pre-listing side, there was interest in measures of time from referral to evaluation, time from evaluation to listing, or in particular active listing, and then the other side of that coin, who is not making it to the wait list, and are there opportunities for measures of equity, comparing a center to the population of people who were referred, which ones are not making it to the wait list at all. There was also interest in a tool that can tell you what types of patients centers are both listing and transplanting, and we've heard that before at this conference from patients, but in particular the breakout group that Corey and I were moderating was asking for it for referring providers so that they can improve efficiency and not waste a patient's time. I thought that was really interesting. That second bucket of causes of death while waiting, this is not necessarily a metric that we came up with, but there was a lot of interest in having this information made available and potentially allowing patients to put into context the existing SRTR metrics like pre-transplant mortality, because some causes of death are going to be more applicable to certain patients. On the center side of things, we heard that they could use that data to sort of internally improve. For example, if they're seeing a high rate of in-hospital death or deaths at outside hospitals, for example, maybe they can improve their consulting with outside hospitals about those particular patients. If they see the patterns of who's deteriorating and then dying on the wait list, that might be able to inform their selection criteria for the wait list, or perhaps alter the resources that they devote to wait list management. Of course, as is always the case with causes of death, there was a lot of concerns about quality, so that would be something to look into and try to avoid causing undue burden being additionally placed on transplant programs. And that's it. I think I won.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to outdo you on that here, Grace. John Miller with the SRTR, and I had the fortune to moderate a discussion among transplant advocates, transplant professionals, and representatives of HRSA, CMS, and the OPTN about what regulators would like to see. And thinking about the how, we actually ended up a lot more on how is data presented and how is it used. And so we did have some specific discussions about presentation of the 1-year survival and possibly thinking about that in terms of mean or median days of survival, adding quality of life measures, but recognizing that can be difficult to start to include patient-reported outcomes just within the framework of how we currently collect data. So there were some specifics along like that, but I think some of the bigger messages that I heard was that one of the more powerful ones was that when we introduce new metrics, regulators should probably be one of the last to start really using that metric for their work. There's unintended consequences at every level when you present a metric, but the regulators have kind of a unique set of unintended consequences. So if something like quality of life is being added to what data is collected and presented, the regulators would want to make sure they really understand how it's used in the community before that becomes part of their universe of measures or metrics that they use for regulatory purposes. But I think the bulk of the discussion really focused around how the information was presented and how it was accessed. So it was pointed out that even among the regulators coming to the SRTR website, there's a wealth of information, but it's hard to figure out which information is relevant to you just on first glance. So I think it's a theme we've heard a lot throughout this conference, but having landing pages for patients, landing pages for regulators, and so forth, so that you can be immediately directed to the type of information that's useful for you. And I just want to close on one of the anecdotes that we had from the patient advocate brought up that you know, she had got SRTR information, presented it to the patient she was advocating for, and the patient said, "I want to see it." So she sent her the link, and the patient came back and said, "Well, I want you to help me walk through it." So she started walking through it, and they got to a point where they ultimately needed to call the SRTR line. So they had an SRTR representative, a patient advocate, and a patient all looking at the data, and that was what was needed to figure out where to go. I think that's an opportunity for improvement.
David Axelrod. I was fortunate to have the payers and a number of the sort of transplant center professionals. Obviously, we had talked about many of the things that we talked about. There was a lot of interest in pre-transplant evaluation, time to event, and listing rates by patient characteristics. A lot of emphasis on the need for risk adjustment as we do that, because we recognize that certain patients are referred late in certain types of communities and that sort of stuff. And so, you know, things like who's getting listed preemptively as a quality metric may not be relevant if you're in a situation where your dialysis centers tend to get patients that present to them late and then are referred late and that sort of stuff. So how do we risk adjust that, and how do we use things? I think the most important thing that I actually heard that hasn't been brought up is the concept of comparing like centers to like centers based on the ecosystem in which they work. And I sort of liken this to the college rankings for your kids. There are college rankings for big universities, and there are college rankings for small colleges. And you know, comparing a single organ, you know, kidney program that serves a rural population that has nobody else that's within 400 miles to the outcomes of a Columbia University or a Duke is probably not accurate, and probably doesn't answer what the patients and what the regulators and payers want. And so, can we come up with a data-driven, stratified analysis to do, you know, like versus like? So rural versus rural versus urban, things about NDI, which is the deprivation index, that sort of stuff. So we can really identify who's serving their community as well as possible, and that may be different, and not hold them all to the same standard. People were interested in, although don't know how to collect the patient-reported outcome stuff. I think that there's a lot of discussion about that, and we want to do that. And then finally, everybody recognized that, you know, the way that we collect data has got to change, that we all need different APIs. We need to stop with manual pushing of data and manual entry of data with all of the judgmental issues inherent, and how do we use things like the electronic data exchanges and other things like that to fill the data, reduce the burden on everybody, and provide more accurate data. So thank you.
Good to go. Hi, Ian Jamieson. We discussed the how for the regulatory side. I had the privilege of moderating with Jesse Schultz and Rich Formoka, and an outstanding group including HRSA, Transplant Center professionals, MPSC, etc. We began our discussion with how do you define what makes a program safe under that regulatory banner. What are the new measures outside of the traditional metrics that can really get at that point? In terms of safety, how does your center provide a distinct survival benefit to patients versus dialysis? You look at the survival of patients on a wait list or transplanted versus dialysis. Now we know all programs are positive here, but is it an absolute how different each program is? How can we measure that? A bad center certainly provides a benefit over, say, dialysis, but can we compare that benefit to a good center? We should then discuss this with reliable long-term data, as we've discussed ad nauseum over the past day and a half, and tailor this metric to each program. In terms of safe patient experience, there's three things that we really focused on. Now we want to push, as a transplant community, we want to push the transplant rate metric, but this could lead to bad decisions and donor selection. Patients would like to know that they're getting the right organ for themselves, but we need to look at whether patients who are supposed to live long do actually live long. Secondly, what received the most votes in our group was receiving a transplant for quality of life purposes, not life extension. For example, transplants over the age of 70, this is a quality of life direction. Current quality of life metrics, they've come such a long way over the past 20 years, they're impactful, but they don't necessarily need to be complex. Simply getting back to work is a key quality of life measure. And one thing that we discussed extensively yesterday was how many days are you alive and not in a hospital over the next 365 days? Again, a very simple measure. Can we develop a personalized survival tool for each patient, which can be extended to non-renal organs? We discuss using time points such as GFRs as a surrogate measure for quality of life. For lung, we have PFTs, for example. For heart, we have ejection fractions. Also, a lot of discussion on equity, which falls squarely in the regulatory domain, and this is a high priority for our current federal administration, is equitable care provided across the country and across the socioeconomic spectrum. How is this measured and acted upon? For example, could you display survival by patient socioeconomic aspects? We recognize that transplanting a high percentage of patients who may be below the poverty line places a huge burden on a transplant center, particularly in staffing, and how can that be quantified? Discussion here about developing a community deprivation score, discussed before, but also discussed at ATC extensively this year. Could we display survival by distance from the transplant center? Could we display survival by education level, etc.? Dual listing was a major discussion and also ranked highly with votes. Dual listing is a reaction to existing inequity, we all know, and it was stated by one member that dual listing is basically buying an organ. Also noted that New York is one state that you cannot dual list in the same DSA. Many patients dual list in areas such as Florida, and can we really identify the fact that dual listing patients means getting a transplant faster? On the donor side, we simply need greater transparency around late declines. This is big discussion with our group. Need to have the details here of what actually happened with each case. Is it an organ donation delay, a hospital delay, a weather delay? There's a lot of legitimate reasons here of why this occurs, and we just simply need to collect this data. And can we score this to identify outlier programs? Some final thoughts. We discussed the percentage of preemptive living donor transplants. This is a key metric that gets to the efficiency of a living donor education sort of component within a transplant program. And finally, as an aspirational goal, we discussed the idea of reviewing the data basically we just outlined in terms of a dashboard at UNOS OPTN regional meetings. The MPSC now has a yellow zone and a red warning zone for our MPSC metrics. Think of this dashboard discussion at regional meetings as effectively a pre-yellow, healthy discussion zone. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to the left side of the table for catching up on time to give Ian time to be a little robust on his comments. That was great. So what do we want to do now? I think what we have is about 20 minutes for open Q&A, comments at the mic. I mean, we've been through a lot here for 3 days. One of the most valuable, most powerful things has been hearing from people, individual comments, questions, and having that interchange. So I'm going to open it up if there are any questions, comments on what you just heard or anything you've heard from the past couple of days and where you want this thing to head. So I see people coming. That's great.
I wanted to add one more thing that I was trying to be short, but Ian brought it up. And that's the idea that, the traditional metrics of looking retrospectively for 2.5-year cohorts may not make use of some of the novel statistical ideas about moving forward. And how can we start to utilize some of the new approaches to predict outcomes? CUSUM was potentially a start to do this, and I think there was a really strong interest from our whole group, and the same kind of thing that Ian mentioned about the red, yellow, green zone. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Melissa Mcqueen. I am the mother of a heart transplant recipient. He was transplanted at 8 months old. He's now 14 and at freshman football camp as we speak. So like to see those success stories. I just wanted to make a few comments. I wanted to thank everyone here for having this reporting dashboard, the SRTR. You've done an amazing job. You truly are the envy of a lot of other groups that I deal with. There is nothing like this anywhere. So to have everyone in this room committed to continual improvement, to making this better, is quite amazing. I just want to make note to that. And then next, let's see. We're all spokes to the same wheel, and that all ends in lives saved and quality lives like freshman football camp and things like that. So let's lean on each other. We don't expect you to have all the answers today, but we do expect that you will continue to reach out to all these stakeholder groups, which I think is phenomenal that they're in the room and willing to help. And through this process, through the next 3 years, let's all work together and get this done, because it's a collaborative effort at the end, and that's what's truly successful. Thank you.
So I thought this was a very fascinating 3 days, and I've learned a lot and talked about a lot. But I think, as you all know, I'm very practically oriented, and I like to get things done. And I think that coming out of this meeting, having some real tangible things to demonstrate that we're focusing on what patients want and need is important. And in that vein, I would want to put my vote in for the days out of the hospital. If you think about that from a patient's perspective, that's key. And if you think about it from just a transplant program's perspective, if you're doing your job and you're doing your job well, you're getting your patients out of the hospital, right? That's the end result. A lot goes into that end result, but it's a nice readout, and it's available. And David, I think your idea of comparing like programs to like programs is actually very patient-centric, right? Lloyd was saying, you know, if you can't get into college, why do you even look at the prospectus? If you can't travel to some of these big programs, why are you having the programs that you can get to compared to those programs? That actually intuitively does not make sense to me. And that approach, if it could be done, seems like it could be very focused on patients and could be put into action with data that we currently have. So I think that's a great idea.
Credit my group for that, not me personally, only spokesman.
Wanted to share some comments and, you know, I think some ideas that came initially from some of the charts that Jesse shared, specifically the socioeconomic disparity and just thinking in terms of equity and the impact transplant can have, but also some of this relates to the stuff Karen shared and some of the metrics that Ian has mentioned. So that chart where we were looking at, you know, transplants by income, I think was a shock at first to take a look at, but what I was thinking about was pre-transplant, I was at an income of 0, or if you consider negative, some of the medical debt that I have, but the impact of my transplant was, if you consider the fact that I actually had to drop out of college a month into my freshman year, the impact of my transplant was that it got me healthy enough and my cognitive function at a level that I could go back to school, right? Because pre-transplant, I remember being in my, what was it, probably multivariate calculus class, and I'd go into a lecture, take all the notes, go do the homework, wake up the next day, go back to class, and not remember what the professor had talked about the day before due to like hepatic encephalopathy and whatnot, right? So thinking about that, you know, dropping out, but then after my transplant, I actually ended up changing majors and getting into one of the top 4 biomedical engineering programs in the country, right? And then now fast forward 12 years, you know, kind of post-transplant, I'm off the charts, right? So if we think about the impact we can have, what more can we do to get people, you know, kind of who are on the lower income end, you know, transplanted, because they can go, you know, go back to school, get a job, and then also help their families out. Because if we really think about it, health is wealth, right? And I think maybe there's some ways that we can capture income pre and post-transplant, and those can have, you know, kind of impact beyond transplant, right? I think the government will look at it, and there's more that we can do, right, if people are getting healthier. And I would also say that instead of win-win, it would be a little bit of a win-win-win. And I think, you know, there's insurance companies in here, so I suggest, you know, some of them think about this as well. Because again, I think if we just think about transplant in general, it takes a patient from a state of lack to a state of abundance. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Merle, and I'm a heart recipient 15 years post-transplant, thanks to the skill of my team and a lot of luck, actually. And that's one thing I wanted to emphasize here, that as a transplant recipient, no amount of data would have really, my looking at data would have actually affected or impacted my being listed and or my transplant. It's a way of me trying to control the process, analyzing the process, but at the end of the day, I'm just a cog in the wheel, and there are too many variables and things happening with the organ retrieval, the organ placement, my place on the list, my team, everything that I have no control over. So really, at the end of the day, I think the patients need to hear the fact that they really don't have any control over the process, but you can be an active participant in the process and be a good patient, which will enhance your chances to be transplanted or maybe give you a better outcome, but you really can't control the process. And as far as Rio's point about days out of the hospital, I think that's very valid, but I think you also need to look at, are they in a LTC or a SNF? Because they're out of the hospital, but they're not well. And some of our patients don't recover and don't do well, but they're still alive. And I made the point the other day that, yeah, I was alive prior to my transplant. Yeah, I was living, but I was not really enjoying life, had no quality of life. So the metric of 1 year survival means nothing if it's not quantified, some sort of quality of life at 1 year, because we were all alive when we had our transplant. So saying you're alive a year later is pretty much meaningless in a sense. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the sensitivity in our data collection and our language. And I found myself reflecting today, this morning on the session, when she used the term donor discard rate. And to me, that's akin to the offensive term that we've tried to eliminate, such as like organ harvest. You know, as far as a donor family, I think organ discard rate is just as offensive as saying organ harvest. And it kind of conjures images of just throwing it away. And whether what language, how we choose to frame it, I'm not here to suggest what that answer is. I just think we need to, as a community, consider that how the language in our statistics and things like that may be interpreted by people who have a vested interest in the process, and how it may actually be offensive to them and or off-putting to the transplant recipient in the same regard. So thank you. I think it's been a wonderful conference. I'm glad I came, and I want to let you all know that I have a presumption that we are all ethical in healthcare, and I know there are challenges but I think we should all approach this as our team is ethical, and they will do the right thing for me based on my needs, and you have to have faith in that, or you're basically in a losing position.
Hi, my name is Ray Kim. I'd like to echo all the others for everybody being here and spending time and coming up with ideas, brilliant ideas. I'm really impressed and enjoyed listening to those. Having said that, I'd like to be mindful of the SRTR's own metric, and that is serving the OPTN committees with advanced statistics, provide performance information on centers and OPOs. So that should be the guidance where we go from here. I know you know this, but But having said that, all the good ideas, we can do more always to improve transplant outcome. And I love Corey's subway map, and it's really important for us to keep that in mind. But I also want to remind everybody that there are people who are not in the subway system. And these are people, if you will, on the street level. They don't know that the subway exists, or don't know where the exit is, or can't read signs where the subway entry point is. So we need to be mindful of that as SRTR. We can't do too much with that, but we can certainly educate people about that. And my own comment about it is some people want to yell at the conductors of the subway cars, pointing to the street level people, saying that how poor a job she's doing running the subway. So you know what I'm talking about, so be mindful of that as well. But again, thank you everybody, and thank you all.
Just a quick housekeeping note. We're going to 11:40. We've got 6 minutes left. We've got people at the mic, so just keep that in mind. We'd love to get all the comments in.
Thank you. I'm Raja Kandaswamy from the University of Minnesota. Having said in this meeting 10 years ago at the consensus conference, I find quite a difference in flavor. The biggest change to me is the amount of participation from patients in this meeting, which is much greater than the last time. And as a result of that, it makes me think, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking the same way, re-examine the scope of what SRTR actually does. I know Ray just mentioned what the mandate of the SRTR is, which is to look at performance metrics, center-specific, and be able to support UNOS and MPSC in that regard. But hearing the input in this meeting, I think the consumers want a consumer-oriented portal, kind of a transplant advisor, if you will, like a TripAdvisor, where they really want qualitative metrics, qualitative data, patient-oriented outcomes, kind of a portal to go to. And I think the two can blend, but I think we need to kind of think about reorienting to a consumer-oriented, starting from website design to all the way over to starting from the onset of disease rather than at the point of transplant or listing. I mean, that will overlap with other organizations, USRDS and others. So just re-examining our mandate just makes me think about this, and John, perhaps you can comment whether this needs I'm sure there'll be thought groups that'll go into this, whether this we should examine this back to our fundamental contract and think about restructuring that.
I know we will. Thank you, Raj. Maybe I could just say a few, just briefly in response to Raja. Yeah, I completely agree, Raja. And the good thing is HRSA over the years has been very receptive to hearing suggestions about how we can improve and structure the contracts accordingly. In fact, I had a nice conversation with Brian Shepard, Chief Executive at UNOS, this morning about how we can hear this information and try to align with UNOS in terms of the types of information they're providing and how we can point each other to each other's sites or other sites as appropriate for good information. So I know HRSA will be, well, I don't want to speak for HRSA, but I would imagine they'd be very open to hearing those suggestions about how we can continue to evolve. The contracts have evolved over time, so I think that's a great suggestion. Kevin.
Yeah, hi, Kevin Fowler, and I just wanted to just make one suggestion, and this is building upon what Dr. Ratner, when he shared that example about that difficult situation, is to think about working with the patient community in a very intentional way that we can help solve problems. Because from my standpoint, there's a lot of problems, and I feel like everyone here wants to do the right thing, but there's only so much you could do. So that would be my request. Think about your problems and think about how we can help you. And lots of lessons you can learn from what's been done with ASN. You can talk to Richard Knight with his AAKP ambassadors. But we want to help you make your lives easier and solve the problems. Thanks.
Hi, Valen Kiefer, double transplant recipient. It's really been amazing, honored to be here. It blows my mind how many people it takes just for one person to get a transplant, and then just everybody that's in the room is really powerful here. A couple things that really has been on my heart is that the fact that twice surgeons and centers have taken a risk on me in order for me to be alive today, and if they wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have received a transplant. I received over 70 blood transfusions before my kidney transplant and was too sick to be put on the wait list. And all of those things that I wouldn't have been a good statistic likely for that center, but they chose to move forward with it. So if somehow we can make sure that the data leaves room, that if it's an educated decision that the doctors feel that they can move forward and take some of those risks, because I wouldn't be here today if the two centers didn't do that for me. Something that we talked about in our session today I think really is powerful is to think of hopeful statistics. I have seen next month, I will celebrate 20 years since my kidney transplant, and the hope that it's given people to see the longevity of life that I've been given because of transplants. So can we incorporate hopeful statistics as well? And of course, being long-term and living the second half of my life has been made possible is I'm really passionate about long-term support, which I know I've said that, but I think if we can do surveys and talk to patients after transplants to find out more about what they're struggling with, then we can I think, provide education and help them, and then have better statistics and longer-term success with transplants. I love pediatric is included because I kind of consider myself sort of pediatric as well, receiving a transplant, being sick at 18 and 19. And also just want to say, as a double organ transplant recipient, I didn't get them at the same time. So I have, you know, a kidney transplant from one person, 16 years later, a liver transplant. So just to think of those statistics as well when creating data, I think would be really powerful, and I'm really grateful for all of you. Thank you.
So, thank you. This has been a great three days, and my name is Jeff Orlowski. I'm currently the co-chair of the review committee for the SRTR, and I'm also the CEO of the OPO in Oklahoma. I go away from here with three things that I really wanted to say today. The first of those is I want to thank the SRTR, John, and your entire team, as well as HRSA and the planning committee and the folks who've done this program for making this possible. It's been incredibly well done. I'm naturally cynical, so anytime I go to one of these things, I kind of wonder how it's going to go. This has been way more than I could have ever dreamed of, and you guys and HRSA deserve credit for creating this forum and making it happen. The second thing I leave here with is a take-home, and that is there are metrics and there's information, and it's very important for us as practitioners in this community, serving a very broad community, not to forget that those are both important things. Yes, there's a place for metrics for regulatory purpose and for financial reimbursement types of purposes, but those metrics cannot overpower the information about the people that we serve and the people that we help and the people who are part of the process. And so from the donor families to the recipient families, the referring physicians, the payers, the transplant centers, everybody, we have to remember that those people need information to operate and not just metrics. And I think that's a really important take home from this conversation. The last thing I think that's really important for us to take away from here, and it was said in some of the breakout rooms I was in, which OPO were the OPO ones, but I'm sure it's come up in others, we have to be careful not to get so focused on the perfect outcome that we don't improve where we're at. The search for perfection can be the enemy of the good, and we see it over and over and over and over again that we become paralyzed by analysis. This is an incredibly complicated world that we function in. There are people who have financial decisions they have to make. There are patients whose lives are at stake. There are donor families who are trying to heal from an incredible loss. And so we need to make sure that we're not holding back progress because we haven't come up with the perfect solution yet. So thank you again, everyone, for being here and for the incredible feedback that I've heard.
Hi, my name is Jess. I am the post-transplant nurse coordinator at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. And I guess today we focused a lot on how we got the information and what metrics we want to use. And I was really hoping we'd talk about how we're disseminating this information. Mostly my thought process is for patients. I recently read a statistic that only 6 out of 10 minorities have a computer, which means that they're getting all their information on a phone if they're lucky enough to have a mobile phone. And so we need to make sure that this information is easy to get on a phone. I tried to go to the SRTR on my phone yesterday, and it was kind of a pain in the ass and really not easy to navigate. You had to keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and if I'm a patient, I'm not going to bother. The other thing to keep in mind is the average person only reads 1 book a year. And if we're only reading 1 book a year, how much of this information are we actually going to read? And we need to make sure that we're giving this information in a way that patients are actually going to look at it and digest it, not just handing them a piece of paper with a list of risk factors, but giving it to them in a way that they're actually going to look at it and actually understand. I feel like I spend a lot of my time just breaking down the information that's in our report card every 6 months for our patients so that they understand it, because they don't understand even the graphs that are on there because it's rates and this, and what does that mean? It's not a real number, Jess. It says 2.1. How can 2.1 people die on your wait list? And so just making sure that we're giving this information in a way that all of our patients can understand and all of our patients have access to. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. I'm Ron Potts. I'm the medical director for Kaiser Permanente's National Transplant Services, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this marvelously run and very, very important meeting. I want to end with both an offer and a challenge. I sit on data that I don't think any of you understand we have on a population of 12.5 million people about everything transplant, journey, time frames, everything we've talked about today, practically we have, and have realized, or we have it available to us way upstream. The challenge and the offer is any of you who wish to partner with us in examining that data in the interest of achieving what we've talked about in these last few days, we would welcome it. I'm not speaking for the entire organization. I can't do that. I may be going out on the limb, but that's what I really want to do. That's what we've worked for years and years, and I hope some of you take me up on that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ron. We will take you up on both the offer and the challenge. Promise. Thank you.
This has been great. I think we're ready to have an SRTR wrap up. Where do we go from here, John and team?
Well, we've made it. End of our conference. We aren't going to keep you long here, but we do want to make sure that people at a minimum understand where we go from here. And so I want to introduce Dr. David Axelrod, whom you all know by now. He's just going to walk us through some real high level of where we go from here, because I think one of the messages we want you to have is that this is not the end of this. We view this as the beginning of this. And there's a lot of work ahead of us, and it will still engage all of you. So I'm going to turn it to David. He's just going to walk us through some of his thoughts on where we go from here.
So I'm going to summarize the discussions we've had in detail over the last 3 days. In reality, I'd like to thank you guys for staying in what was in scope and what was out of scope. I think what we've really found that what was in scope is actually all the information that we need. And I think we stayed away from some of the issues that really don't need to be discussed here, and really focused on how we can improve and help. The steering committee was really remarkable. They've been your moderators for a lot of the sessions. They've contributed a lot of incredible data. I think this day really did an incredible job of trying to put some meat on the bones of the work that's been done by this group over the last 2 years. This is what John was mentioning. We see this as an iterative process. We don't think it's going to be 10 more years till we have one of these. I think it's going to be 5. I think we heard a lot of challenges, that things we thought we did well 10 years ago might need to be tweaked. And I think we also heard a lot of endorsements of some of the information and the ways that we did change the website that have been very helpful. And so, as John said, that we are going to continue to work with this incredible group, both at the steering committee, and we hope all of you guys to use these data to incorporate and to implement the recommendations. Unfortunately for the steering committee, they're not done yet. We will be having continual meetings to try to refine and put this together, both as a manuscript for the community, as well as for some real action items. We see another conference coming in the next 2, 3, 4 years. We will report on this, and we will assess our change. And we want your feedback. We want to make sure at the end of the day, as we heard from Jesse, we need to measure the metrics. We got to make sure the metrics are doing what we think that they're doing. And I think, as Jeff said, we need to make sure that we don't get caught up in just reporting metrics for specific uses, that we forget to provide information to the people that really need it on the ground, and that's the patients, their families, and the people who take care of them every day. We're in this big snake diagram, and as you can see, it's, what do you call a Moby? Isn't it like a Moby strip, one of those things that, Mobius? There you go, thank you, Rhea. it never ends, right? So this process gets better, you know, and we're going to come back in 4 or 5 years and say, are there other who's and whys that we hadn't thought about? What do we need to know now? As we heard from groups, let's stop necessarily using the same tools we've been doing and just try to refine them and utilize new tools. You know, how do we use forward-looking metrics and things like that? You know, how do we provide, you know, use these data to provide patient-specific tools for patients and payers and their families to find the right center that's right for them. And that may not be the center that has the topmost one-year post-transplant outcome, as we heard eloquently said by many of our patients. It's the center that wants to put that patient on their waiting list and wants to take an organ for them and is in a place that they and their family can get to. And hopefully we can have stratified outcomes in a way that you guys can understand that. We will prioritize the recommendation. The SRTR review committee that's headed by Jeff over there are a series of professionals that are involved in all aspects of transplantation and advise the SRTR. We obviously get direction also from HRSA, who are the contract holders, about what we do. We have a variety of subcommittees that look at things like the way we do the analysis. Really, really importantly, and I think it's a credit to John and to the SRTR as it is and stands today, and Allison and her hard work, that we have a patient and family affairs committee. Many of the folks that are here participate. Please continue. I think it adds meat, it adds depth, it reminds us to stay grounded. It sometimes helps the professionals get out of our own way to argue over the stupid parts of what we do and remember what we're really here for. And we hope that you will help us redesign the process so that, as Jess said, it's an easily accessible thing with meaningful data and that sort of stuff. And I think Corey's done an incredible job. I think it will be his legacy that we will all be riding the subway to transplant at that point. And, I think it really did help us frame it. I first looked at it and I said, my God, it's like somewhat worse than trying to figure out how to get from National Airport up to the Pentagon, in the subway system. But as you think through it and as you see how those lines intersect, and as you sort of both first dissect them and then reconnect them, you understand how complex the system is and how important it is to have a way to go through them in a way that's structured and logical. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for all of their time. We want your feedback. If you have additional comments, the public comment thing, I believe, is still open. Please send in comments. If things, you walked away and you say, I really don't want you to forget this, that, or the other thing, I think, there are some very simple things we should take away right now. I think that the term organ discard needs to be discarded as of today. And we have lots of things we can take away. So thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you, David. And I do want to say, too, just one word of organization. If you didn't get a chance to turn in your sheets from your breakout groups, please leave those on this table up here in the front. We will be collecting and analyzing and going through all the recordings, even of all the breakouts, and we will write that up. So that's going to take us some time, but we want to make sure we capture all that data. So if you haven't had a chance to turn in your sheets, please do so. All right, with that, I do want to turn it over to our sponsors, to HRSA, and just give our core. I'll introduce our core. That stands for our contracting officer representative from HRSA. She oversees all of the work of the SRTR. We meet with Shannon regularly, so I'd like to just give Shannon the opportunity to say a few words.
I'm so glad that I was able to be part of this consensus conference along with Frank Holloman, Carol Johnson, our administrator, and several other HRSA staff who participated virtually. When HRSA originally included Task 5 and the requirement for a consensus conference in our 2020 SRTR contract, it was part of a larger effort to increase transparency and accessibility for all transplant community stakeholders, especially patients and caregivers. And this conference has been a critical step in that effort. So I'd like to thank the SRTR Review Committee, the Task 5 Steering Committee, and most especially the SRTR leadership and staff for their tremendous work in planning and coordinating what I think has been a very successful event. So thank you also to everyone here for participating, and I look forward to the next steps in this effort. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. On behalf of the directors, I just want to thank you all for your engagement in this process. We agree, and we're so thankful to hear the sentiment that you thought this was a useful and well-run meeting. I hope you continue to engage with us. One of the most important aspects of the participation here has been the patient engagement, and I really want to personally thank them for being here, those both in the room and online, and all of the engagement we've had through that process. But more importantly, I want to just bring Allison up to the mic, who I think wants to say a few words about our patients. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. And actually, since you made the mistake of giving me the mic, I would just like to say that I've personally witnessed the amount of time and energy that John Snyder has put into making this not just happen, but happen well. So just in case that doesn't happen later. So I really want to take the opportunity to thank our patients and family members for showing up. And I mean showing up. Like, you guys showed up. I've said this before. I think a few months ago somebody asked me personally what success at this conference would look like, and I said it would be if we not only have a good representation in the room, but participation. And I cannot tell you how happy it made my heart when the very first person up to the mic was a patient. So I know it takes a lot of courage. I know what it's like to be in a room with people that you are sure know more than you, and so I really appreciate you leaning into your expertise as patients. Just as fair warning, we've decided this is an opt-out, so you're on my list. I have your emails. I plan to continue to reach out to you, so you need to let me know if you don't want to hear from me anymore, which is fine. I totally get that. And I just want to reiterate that this is the beginning. This is not the end. This wasn't get people here and hear what you have to say and send you on your way. I have your emails. I really we want to continue to work with you, because as we create these things, as you said, this is where the work starts. We can create things, but if nobody knows about it, we could make the best website in the world, not going to help anyone if nobody knows it exists. And as we make things, we need to run them by you, because what we think makes sense, I've been in that room 100 times where I present something that I thought was amazing and nobody gets it. We're okay hearing that. I get it. So I can't say it enough. Thank you. We will continue to be in touch, and just I hope you leave this place feeling that how much we appreciate your involvement.
And one of the comments I heard routinely throughout the meeting was how much people enjoyed the subway map, and that is really the product of Corey Schaffhausen's mind and much of the engineering of this. We just couldn't have done it without Corey. I just have a new appreciation for the human-centered design engineering component, and I feel so fortunate to have him on staff. So thank you, Corey. I also want to say a thank you to the rest of the team here, the professionals, right? I mean, we engage with you a lot throughout various venues, and to have you here and participating with us in this, I have a renewed sense of just the partnership in our community, that we're all striving toward the same goal to help these patients out in their journey. So my thanks to the professionals for engaging. And I really have a renewed hope that we can find places that we can all come together around certain data that we can make available to help these patients. So thank you so much. Just a few last things before we move on. I want to thank the steering committee again. Just a round of applause for these people. They have given countless volunteer hours to help make this happen, and we couldn't have done that without them. These are all the people that helped lead your moderator groups. When we decided to offer the virtual component, which I think was really helpful to get more patients involved, we had to double essentially the number of moderators we had, because we ran all of the groups that were in the room here, we also ran online. So my thanks to all of those folks, and if we could just give them a round of applause. Thank you. And finally, the sponsors of our patient travel. We have offered all of the patients the opportunity to be reimbursed for their travel to get here, and these are the companies that made that possible. So let's thank them for making that possible. And with that, I want to finally thank our staff that really did the nuts and bolts of all the planning. So they're in the back, and hopefully you've had a chance to maybe just wave your hand. I see Mona, I see Tanya's back there. Amy is somewhere. Amy's in the room, and Pam, of course, helping out with much of the logistics as well. So my thanks to them. It's truly a team effort here at the SRTR, and we have a great team. So, and again, finally, thanks to everybody for engaging, those of you in the room, those of you online. We wish you safe travels home. So thank you.